takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Belton, and I'm a director of the Canadian Club of Toronto. The airline industry has been heavily impacted by COVID-19. Travel restrictions, border closures, canceled vacations. As Canadians try to grapple with a new normal, business leaders have had to shoulder the responsibility of modifying their offerings to protect consumers and employees while continuing to provide quality service. If there was ever a time that an organization needed strong, decisive, and thoughtful leadership, that time is right now. Today, we're joined by Calin Rovinescu to hear his predictions and priorities for the future as he nears the end of his tenure and what he's learned being a leader during these incredibly uncertain times. Before we dive into today's topic, here's some information about how to participate with us. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. Video quality may decrease, but the audio quality remains strong. Once you click the Questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. The Request Help button is located in the bottom right corner of the page, and it's for technical support. Thank you to today's event sponsor, PwC, and today's access sponsor, TD. Thanks to TD's generous support, today's event is free of charge to all attendees. The Canadian Club is a non-profit, and we've been gathering people together for 124 years. It's because of our sponsors that we can continue to do that. We're grateful for your support of today's discussion. Now, to introduce today's speaker, Calin Rovinescu is President and Chief Executive Officer of Air Canada, having served in this role since April of 2009. Mr. Rovinescu was recognized by Canada's Outstanding CEO of the Year by the Financial Post magazine, has been appointed a member of the Order of Canada, and has been recognized as Canada's Outstanding CEO of the Year twice by Globe and Mail's Report on Business. Today, Mr. Rovinescu will be joined in conversation by Amanda Lang, anchor and reporter for BNN Bloomberg. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is that we toast to our country, usually done in person with the raising of a glass. But let's make a nod towards the screen and toast Canada. To Canada. Amanda, I'll now turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. And it is wonderful to be here with Calin. Calin, thank you for your time. Before we get going, I think people know this about what you've been going through and how difficult it is. The company that you run and have run so ably for so long burns through about $8,000 a minute. So just to keep it in context of what you're dealing with right now, I did want to start there of how you're doing. And I mean, you, not just corporately, Calin, but it's been a lot. So thank you for your time. How's it going?
Well, thanks very much, Amanda. And it's a pleasure to see you again and to do this with the Canadian Club. Look, there's no, we've been around many crises, from 9/11, the restructuring of Air Canada, the global financial crisis, and then this. And so I have to say, amongst all of the various crises that we face, this one obviously is one for the record books. It has been a very, very, very difficult time for so many people, so many of our own people. Personally speaking, I'd say one of the most difficult moments was to see that we had to make the workplace reductions in April and May following what was an unbelievable period of growth for us, where we had created 10,000 jobs over the last 5 years, and then to sort of see that disappear in such a short period of time was very painful for me personally, I have to say. So we've had to do what we've had to do, and we made the decision that we would act decisively coming out of it, but it has been a very, very difficult time for our people. Of course, we're in that environment where we cannot all work remotely because, of course, we're still operating flights. So it puts added strain on people with families. It's a complicated environment for the employees of Air Canada right now. And I have to say, I take my hats off to all of them for continuing to do a very, very able job in a virtually impossible environment.
And virtually impossible. I mean, nobody foresaw a global pandemic other than Bill Gates. And so, I mean, this comes out of the blue. And as you say, you've dealt with other crises. The industry has weathered other storms. And we'll get to this, but the grounding of one of Boeing's key new planes alone would have been a pretty huge body blow to you guys. You're still dealing with that. In this pandemic, if you could rewind to last March, are there things that could have happened that didn't happen? Are there things you wish we'd done differently to help you as the industry, but you, Air Canada, get through this better?
Yes, no, for sure. I think that there are a tremendous number of learnings here, and hopefully the world will never go through another pandemic of this scale. But the way the lockdown was implemented, and the scale and scope of the border restrictions, the travel restrictions, the quarantine, the magnitude of that was, of course, catastrophic. We have been advocating for the last number of months for a science-based approach to it. I think that generally, as a country, we were caught flat-footed, I would say, in terms of using science-based measures to have a more thoughtful approach to dealing with this. And for sure, we had to have a shutdown and a lockdown of some aspects of business. We had to try to get the pandemic under control, but like anything else, you have to understand how it's released. And I think that this has been one of our great frustrations, is leaving aside the whole question around support for the industry, which many other countries around the world have seen. Leaving that aside, maybe we'll talk about that afterwards. I'd say that one of the things that I found disappointing is that we did not actually, as a country, zero in on the areas that were most at risk. The seniors' residences, the factories where people are working in very close quarters without a lot of ventilation. We ended up having a blunt instrument that applied across all industries, and that, of course, basically shut down aviation. And here we are 9 months later and still operating at something, at 10% of the passenger revenue that we operated last year, which is, of course, not sustainable in perpetuity.
Even IATA, the Global Air Transport Association, has called out the Canadian policy around air travel, the quarantine. And when you say science-based, I mean, what and as we go along here, as you say, we shut down in a blanket way in the beginning. We'd like to get more surgical as we go. Are you surprised? Are you disappointed that we haven't gone more quickly to what other places have done, which is a shorter quarantine with testing, other ways that would allow you to operate and reopen travel again?
Correct. And so, at the beginning of this pandemic, of course, nobody knew exactly what we were dealing with, and that was fair enough. And so we, as an industry, and Air Canada in particular, in some respects, leading the industry, we had a lot of biosafety initiatives that we implemented right away. We introduced something we called, Clean Care Plus, which was, of course, had temperature checks before anyone did temperature checks on airlines. And indeed, at the beginning, with some opposition from the, health authorities that thought that was not a good idea to do temperature checks. So the first to do temperature checks, we were the first to introduce a mask, not only for our crew, but mandated for customers. And then Transport Canada eventually followed that. And all of the cleaning protocols. We distribute a little bag with sanitizer and masks and gloves and so on and so forth. And so we introduced all that with the hope of being able to show that actually traveling on board an aircraft is actually pretty safe. Coupled with the HEPA filters, the air filtration systems, which pick up something like 99.97% of any infection. So we said, all right, well, that at least we will take the responsibility to tell the customer that it's safe to be on an aircraft. That's science-based. But equally, we expected there to be a much more rigorous adoption of testing, both the PCR testing on departure, more importantly, testing on arrival if we want to ease the quarantine, and rapid testing. And I'd say on all of those fronts, we're 9 months into this, but yet we are still, I would say, relatively speaking, in early innings of having something that is broadly adopted. Other countries have done really, really well with testing. And we ourselves have sponsored a key study by McMaster University at Pearson, which the results were just released yesterday, and extremely, extremely encouraging. More than 99% of all passengers arriving at Pearson, international passengers who participated in that study, and there are something like 40,000 test samples that have been taken. More than 99% of them tested negative on day one. And then of the 1% that tested positive, 70% of them tested negative on day 7. And then the remaining 30% of the 1% were negative on day 14, which basically shows that we are keeping everybody into a quarantine environment where materially less than 1% would otherwise be, and this is the largest study of its kind in the world. So we're optimistic that this should lead to a more thoughtful, science-based easing of the quarantine.
There are many ways in which government policies here have affected your ability to do business and service routes, and I do want to talk about that because it's been clear that our federal government takes seriously your responsibility, if I can put it that way, all of the airlines, to keep serving our vast country. What you referred to the lack of aid. Canada stands out in the world for not supporting its airlines, particularly directly or really indirectly. I mean, I know there are programs you can use, but many of them didn't really apply to you folks. Just give me your insight, Calin, into what that is about. Why all along, from the very beginning, we heard from this government, aid is coming, we're thinking about it, we're putting something together, we still have yet to see anything.
Well, I'd say that there's three components to that, Amanda. One is the government early on, for better or for worse, came to the conclusion that there was not going to be sector-specific support. The expression that was used, and I say this with respect for the decision makers, and I think Minister Morneau spoke about it very, very openly in those days, that there was going to be a sector-agnostic approach to supporting businesses. Again, respectfully, that did not and does not make any sense whatsoever when you have an industry like ours that has been taken to its knees, not by any incompetence or lack of effort of anything that the industry has done, but by the pandemic, coupled with the very, very onerous travel restrictions. So the government has basically shut us down to begin with, and operating at 10%, company like ours that was doing nearly $20 billion of revenue last year, if you're only doing 10% revenue, that's $2 billion on an annualized basis. Of course, we had a relatively normal first quarter, but $2 billion if you annualized it, meaning that you're losing $18 billion of revenue, right? I mean, these are big numbers and a large dynamic. So one was a sector agnostic approach, which was, I would respectfully suggest, ill-founded. Two, there was not an immediate crisis because Canadian Airlines and Air Canada in particular were strong coming into this. We were not facing an insolvency event the next day or the next week or the next month. But that again is ill-founded logic, because what that means is that they are going to weaken us until the point of not being competitive with what is going on in other countries. Thirdly, this wage subsidy, which we did benefit from, much smaller in scale than what our U.S. competitors would have benefited from, was sort of seen as a band-aid for all industries, all companies that had lost, I think more than 30% of revenue. But the scale of what we were doing was so significant for the country, domestically and internationally, that I think there was a lack of perhaps understanding and appreciation for the fact that aviation has become critical infrastructure for the country. And this is what I think you're referring to when you're saying that parts of the country need to continue to be served. And I think that the government is dealing with that now and is recognizing that, to wit, Minister Garneau's statements of about 2 weeks ago.
We have seen more recently what sounds like, I guess, more serious talk about some kind of financial aid coming. It's tied to, it'll be no doubt tied to regional service, Calin, that, they've signaled loud and clear that they want to be able to show that they consider that important. But they're also tying it to cash refunds. And I do want to hit this because it's been a sore point for travelers globally. If you do a quick search of this, folks in the UK are unhappy, and folks in Sweden have been unhappy. There's nowhere that the passengers are super happy about the refund situation. Should you be forced to give cash refunds if you take government money? Is it that straightforward?
Right. Yeah. No. The answer to that is yes, assuming that the structure of the government support is commensurate with the damage that we have incurred as an organization. The answer is yes. I think that it is all, the devil is in the detail, to be very blunt. I mean, it's the scale of the support, the terms and conditions of the support, and how quickly it comes in, and so on and so forth. This has been one of the most difficult chapters of this saga, I would say. The number one objective of our organization has been to stay alive. I mean, that is the number one, survival. In an environment where we did not have any visibility as to whether we'd receive any support, as to how long the pandemic lasts, as to what happens to the border closures. Of course, that is not the fault of any one of our customers, but that's the reality that we're faced with. So we did refund something like $1.2 billion of refundable fares, but of course the dynamic goes to the non-refundable fares, and to the extent that that the government is supportive and does provide a sufficiently appropriate support package here, of course that would be something we deal with. We also respected the ordinances that and the expressions of opinion that were put forward by the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency, on this topic early on, because I think there was a lot of confusion as to what was the legal obligation. So, we made the decision that we needed to stay alive, we needed to survive, we needed to respect our refundable obligations, and at the same time, follow the CTA guidelines. And so hopefully now we'll have something that will be more generous than that, and we could ourselves provide cash refunds.
You mentioned this word survival, and you were part of the group that raised this airline from the ashes, near ashes, Calin. When you think about that prospect, what stands between Air Canada and not surviving?
Well, I think the question is, what is the duration of this pandemic? I think we are as well positioned as any airline on the planet to survive on our own. And this is what we had been positioning ourselves for. We had the strongest balance sheet, amongst the strongest, if not the strongest, of the non-state-owned airlines in the world coming into this. And, we had, that goes to how much liquidity we had on our balance sheet relative to our revenues, our net debt level. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we've raised $6 billion, which is a real show of support from the capital markets through a series of different types of financings, from an equity issue to several debt issues to aircraft financings to sale leaseback. So a series of different creative transactions that are finance and legal teams put together very, very quickly. Big show of support. So we are well positioned to survive. But the question is, we were very competitive coming into this. We were, generally speaking, seen as one of the leading carriers in the world. We had an international network that spanned all 6 continents and 220 destinations around the world, and we want to be competitive. It's not just survival, and that's where we kind of look with with some envy at our competitors that have received at this moment in time a grand total of $175 billion of support from their governments, and whereas in Canada we've received no sector-specific support thus far. So survival is one thing, and that's I guess that's getting out of the starting block. But after survival, you want to be competitive, which is what we have been, for the last decade, as we built our global footprint.
When you were able to tap the markets to raise capital, obviously that's a vote of confidence in you and the team and the business and your balance sheet. There's a limit on that, of course, and obviously your creditors will look at your balance sheet and say, well, there's a lot of long-term liability here. Your cash flow is a big factor, which gets to when you think normal appears and your ability to keep financing. So let's take that in 2 parts. Are you comfortable with the balance sheet today? Do you feel as though you've taken on a lot of debt? For sure, you have a lot of debt, but are you comfortable with it?
Yeah, no, we are comfortable with it, and to temper the debt to some level is why we did that equity issue very successfully. We know that it's not appropriate to put that much pressure on the debt side, and so we have raised equity as well, and we have a convertible as well, which would potentially allow some of the debt to convert to equity at some point in time. So the answer is yes. We're comfortable with our balance sheet, but obviously it goes to the other part of your question as to how long does this last? When do we start seeing some return to normal? And obviously we've been encouraged by the 2 vaccine candidates that have shown great promise. Now this morning we saw Pfizer say that they're 95% efficacy, which is greater than what had previously been announced. The Moderna one, also 95% efficacy with a lower temperature grade requirement. So those are both extremely positive. But as I said in our third quarter analyst call, we have to be a little careful not to get out ahead of our skis, because we know that there will be a fair amount of distribution complexity and supply chain complexity to get the vaccine out, especially for a business that is as international as an airline, and especially for airlines that are particularly international, like Air Canada, that built this very, very important global network. So even if the first quarter next year, there's a vaccine that's available, will it be adequately disseminated, distributed, throughout the world to avoid that? And what is the behavior of governments in dealing with, the travel restrictions side of this? Because even if customers are more comfortable to travel, and we're seeing it happen right now, where customers want to travel, but they're not because of the constraints on the quarantine. So this is one of those situations that for sure extremely encouraging signs, and our share price has reflected that since the Pfizer and Moderna announcements have come out. Mm-hmm. But it does require a collective work with still testing. I'm not going to scrap our initiatives around the testing at Pearson, for example, to become the standard for the country in terms of exempting, or easing quarantine restrictions. Rapid testing, we were slow to adopt rapid testing, which exists in many, many other countries. We've accepted now as a country the Abbott rapid tests, but we haven't seen them readily available. The proper screening of which countries are greater risk than other countries, and creating, somewhat travel corridors and travel bubbles. So it's going to take all of that. I'm not looking at the vaccines as being some sort of panacea for, that miraculously everything returns to normal the next day.
In fact, the numbers that we see from folks in the industry suggest that even once the virus is, quote unquote, under control, whatever that looks like, gone, it's a long time before we see volume levels return. Just walk through your thinking on, I've seen 3 to 5 years, I've seen out to 7 years. Why wouldn't we snap back to normal volume faster than that, Calin?
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. And I'd say that many airlines around the world have got different perspectives on it. We declared our perspective very, very early on. And then what happens is once you declare your perspective, if you're going to be true to it, you have to start taking steps in consequence of that perspective. So we believed it was going to be 3 years, minimum 3 years is what we said. We don't think it's 7 years, but we said it's going to be 3 years. How did we come to that conclusion? We came to that conclusion on the basis that we believed that that the so-called VFR segment, which is visiting friends and relatives, which is generally seen as, we have a lot of communities that will go to India, to China to visit family members and so on and so forth. And of course, in a North American context, it exists as well between Canada and the United States. So the visiting friends and relatives segment we expected would return more quickly than business. We also, in the early stages, we had to make a bet on how we thought that these video, these various video platforms like Zoom and so on, what impact that would have on the business travel. We also looked at how much connecting traffic. When you build a global network, you count on a certain amount of connecting traffic. So flows from, someone from Brazil going to Japan over Canada, someone from, Los Angeles going to Italy over Toronto. And we did a lot of that kind of business. So we sort of made the assessment early on that the combination of the fact that the VFR segment would recover more quickly than business, the fact that connecting traffic would be a bit more cumbersome based on border restrictions, that it would take 3 years. And then we said, well, then we better, if we believe that, we better act on that. And that went to our capital allocation for the next 3 years. So, we've taken out 79 airplanes from the permanent fleet. 79 airplanes, that's a big, big number for us. Yeah. Some of them were older aircraft that would have had to be retired over the next number of years, but we early retired them this year. All of our 767s that were in Rouge, our Embraer aircraft that were in mainline, and the some Airbus 319s and 320s. And you may have seen, we've recently announced that we are shrinking our Boeing 737-800 and Airbus A220 orders by 22 aircraft, which is also very significant. Mm-hmm. So we're making the assumption that we will be smaller for 3 years. Now, some of those airplanes will start coming back in, and that goes to the crews that you have, the networks that you build, the stations that you close. You have to make a decision, and we sort of made that decision, and therefore cannot snap back because, as a result of some of these decisions that we made to mitigate exposure and to, deal with your earlier question on how do we feel about the balance sheet and not, over-lever ourselves, we made the decision that we would be smaller for several years.
A tough decision, one obviously that goes to kind of prudence around how you manage through all of this. I mean, arguably you did two important things in your tenure here since restructuring this airline. And one was modernize and improve the fleet, right? The planes were good and new, and it was a great fleet of aircraft. The other was a long-term labor agreement with some of your labor, and that is key and elusive in this industry, and I think a signal achievement. Long-term only lasts so long, and if memory serves, it may be in sight, right, where we begin to say, you can kind of see the end of that. How is labor with all of this? Where is your staff, which are obviously suffering, as you say, through a horrific period as well?
Yeah, well, look, as you say, the airline industry has had, especially the legacy airline carriers, have had a long history of tenuous labor relations because, so much of what it is that we do counts on very, very large workforce. And so any part of the workforce can interfere with a reasonable operation at any point in time. And so this has always been one of the dynamics, and we've seen it to play out in the US and even in the past for Air Canada. As we changed our culture, this has been one of our, one of the cornerstones of what I'm proudest of over the last 10 or 12 years is that as we changed the culture of Air Canada, we made it very, very clear that an engaged workforce will lead to the kind of growth that we saw, the profitability that we had, the extra airplanes, the extra jobs, and all of that should nonetheless be capable of delivering a profit. If we deliver a profit, that will lead to, sort of good share price performance, et cetera, et cetera. And we've actually, I think, built an amazing culture with, I would say, all of our labor groups. And frankly, our pilots, showed great leadership in signing that long-term labor deal, which led to subsequent long-term arrangements with other labor groups. And you're right, it was a 10-year deal, which was almost unheard of at the time, and it's coming up over the next few years. But we've worked very, very closely with all of our labor groups throughout this downsizing. It has, obviously for many individuals, has not been easy, but we've had tremendous support in terms of sort of right-sizing the organization for what we believe the next 3 years are going to be. And in the case of the pilots, for example, because of the various training requirements, and you mentioned the 737 MAX dynamic, that's going to come back into the fleet at some point. So because of the scale of all of the training dynamics, we are carrying more staff and more pilots than we would normally be carrying if we're only operating kind of 10% of our based on revenues, 10% of what we did last year. We certainly are carrying way more than that in terms of staff, and all those required negotiations. But I've been very, very encouraged to see how our labor groups have responded and how our union leaders have responded through this. I also need to, on the labor front, I do need to give a mini shout out. I have no idea whether he's listening or would hear this, but somebody who's been extremely supportive, especially on the very onerous travel restrictions, has been Jerry Diaz at Unifor. He runs the largest labor group in the country, and has been really one of the most vocal in terms of supporting us in our discussions to have science-based measures and a thoughtful opening up of travel, as well as some form of support package that is commensurate with the United States.
You mentioned the MAX, and I do want to hit that quickly because, absent a global pandemic, that was the big story for the airline industry. It was a body blow, obviously, to not just Boeing, but to airlines which had acquired these planes. They're coming back, according to the FAA. What are you waiting for, and what does it look like from your point of view in terms of reintroducing those into the fleet and making customers feel comfortable about them?
Okay, so yeah, in fact, it's ironic that today is the very day that the FAA officially unground the aircraft in the United States. I say unground, I mean at this stage, not for the carriage of passengers, but for all of the proper training activities that are required to be undertaken by U.S. carriers. We expect that Transport Canada and EASA, which is the European regulator, will follow suit in a 2 or 3 stage process. First, to allow training, and there's different sort of regulatory mechanisms that are used for these things. First, to allow training, repositioning of aircraft training, and then I expect that we will be able to start operating passenger flights early in the new year, January, February kind of environment. We're going to do it in a very, very thoughtful way, meaning, after all of the various testing that we ourselves will do, beyond what Transport Canada and EASA and FAA have done. There's been some wiring changes in addition to the MCAS issue, and based on all of the work that has been done, we're quite confident. But of course, we're not taking anything for granted. We were the only ones, you might remember, because of the fact that the MAX we did not operate the 737 variant pre-purchasing the MAX, and so we were the only carrier in North America at the time that had simulators, MAX simulators, as opposed to 737 NG simulators. And so none of our flights that we had operated many, many flights before these 2 tragedies that had taken place. We had not seen any of the variances, airspeed variances that came up in those cases. And our pilots had already had that simulator training. You see, that was really one of the advantages for us, where no one else in North America had that. Now, in this current environment, they will all have that because they all now have the MAX simulators and are working in that environment. But we'll also look to the United States for some early learnings, because they will be flying passengers on the MAX before us.
You know, one of the things in history will tell the tale better than we can, but one of the things that story has kind of unearthed, and it's been, I think, underscored by the pandemic, Calin, is the kind of tension we have between government policy, regulators setting policies, and businesses playing a role or leading. In this pandemic, we really turned it over to governments. They've been really in charge of a lot of the policies. Businesses have just had to adapt. At what point should that shift? And I want you to focus your attention on Atlantic Canada. There's a Supreme Court challenge going on about the mobility infringement. Canadians can't travel to Atlantic Canada, and there is a civil rights claim that violates our charter rights. It also, of course, keeps your business from operating normally. At what point do you have a claim against governments for shutting down parts of your viable business?
Well, it's an interesting question, and obviously, I think that I'll reserve the whether or not we have a claim against government for the time being. But I will say this, as what we've lived here in Canada through this pandemic and through this provincial environment is one where it sort of shows some of the strengths, but many of the weaknesses that are involved in our separation of powers, federal and provincial. The idea that in Canada, that provinces could simply prevent Canadians from entering their province is pretty amazing, I would say. It's pretty extreme. It's one thing to say, here are the requirements, here are the public health requirements, but I'm actually going to prohibit Canadians from entering our province. I would say that the folks that are making that claim, and this is perhaps wearing my hat as a practicing lawyer for many years, I would say that they would have a pretty good right of action to say, if I had an ailing mother in Newfoundland and I was a resident of Ontario, I'm sorry. I'm deeply sorry to our friends in Newfoundland or our friends in Prince Edward Island or elsewhere. You're going to prevent me from entering your province and I need to have special dispensation and so on. I'm sorry. So I would say two things, Amanda. One, we have seen here perhaps the best of provincial federal separation of powers in the fact that they work really, really well together as they were cobbling the early stages of the response plan, but the worst of it because Canada has stood by and allowed that to happen, and we're supposed to operate in one country with a charter of rights and freedoms. Mm-hmm. Secondly, you raised another very interesting point, and it was a segue from the Boeing discussion, which I think is extremely, extremely important, especially for a business audience, as I assume most of this is. What is the role of the private sector, and what is the role of business in a crisis environment, in a pandemic environment? And I would, again, respectfully suggest that it ought to be much greater. People in business, and we've proven it. We are trained to move quickly. We have a focus on not only on the short term, but building things that are sustainable, that will sustain for the long term. And the idea that you can actually, key into all the brain power that exists in the private sector is something that has been underutilized. And I would say it really is a shame and a loss. And people talk grandiose plans about public-private partnerships, but I have really yet to see something meaningful in terms of a real partnership of the private sector being called in to help. I know that several companies had Canada Goose needs a shout out because they moved from producing what they were producing to producing PPE. CAE produced some respirators and so on and so forth. So you have pockets where private sector companies have stepped in, but I would say that it is largely anecdotal than sort of a strategy.
One place where this may come up with some urgency now is around vaccinations, how they're distributed, and then importantly, I imagine that in your industry you're already doing the thinking around how do you qualify somebody to board or not board a plane if they have a vaccine or don't have it? There will be interesting issues around this. Do you think the right thinking is going on now? And what are you thinking at Air Canada about it to make sure that it rolls out smoothly if and when we do get our hands on doses?
Yeah, no, absolutely, big time. No, this is a huge issue. Our expectation, and this is one where again, not only national governments like Canada, but international countries, like through the UN body, which is ICAO, which is meant to be the global regulator of aviation. ICAO and IATA have already worked together to have some common protocols. And I think, what I would envisage longer term is that you would have basically the equivalent of a health passport. Now, it could be a digital health passport, but you would have a health passport. So have I been tested in the last 72 hours? Here's my evidence. Have I had vaccine? Have I had 2 doses of the vaccine? How do I know that it's the vaccine that is, approved internationally? Well, here's my evidence, Moderna or Pfizer or whatever it is. So I think, in the old days, we used to carry a little, yellow passport showing our vaccinations if we went to, countries that had yellow fever exposure. But yeah, I do see that being a requirement. And the only way that can function in a connected world is with a common platform, a digital common platform that IATA as the industry association and ICAO as the industry regulator, which is a United Nations body, therefore whatever it is, 240 countries of the UN participate. But then you have to let them do their work. And this is where, because just as we saw, individual countries say, yeah, that's good enough, but I'm not doing that. I'm opting out. And, that's where it starts falling apart. Because right now we're facing almost on a daily basis, we still are operating flights into Hong Kong. Hong Kong imposes new regulations by the day. Our crews might have to quarantine in a Hong Kong kind of a designed capability for some period of time if somebody has tested positive on that flight, even if they're not positive. So you have all kinds of changing requirements by the day and country by country. It is, almost unmanageable. And that's why I say I take our hats off to our people who are putting up with this on a day of basis under extreme difficulty.
Obviously there may be some increasing form of partnership between governments and business as we move along here. You think there almost has to be as we get into some of those more practical issues. There's another form of partnership that could be on the table for you, Calin. We keep hearing that aid to your business might come with an equity stake. Are you willing to allow government to own part of this airline in order to get aid?
Look, that's also, that's an amazing question, and one that has, frankly, the Canadian Club could probably do a whole seminar on that very question. I will, you never say never because you don't know the circumstances that can come up. So I'm not making this statement as a never statement, but what I will give you is the benefit of, more than 30 years of experience in both airlines and in, sort of public sector governance models. Governments owning stakes in airlines are extremely, extremely bad ideas. That's a really bad idea. Why? Because the fact that we have had the success that Air Canada has had since privatization, for the history buffs in the room, I was lead counsel when Air Canada was privatized now more than 3 decades ago, which shows you how old I am and why it is that I am retiring. But in those days, there was a lot of discussion about maintaining a stake in the airline. And after a lot of consideration, the decision was that it would be fully privatized and allowed to go into the private sector. And of course, the transition to the private sector took many, many, many years. And indeed, I would say 20 years until we saw the success of what we lived over the last decade. Air Canada struggled. If you look around the world, airlines that have had government ownership, with the possible exception, with the exception of the Gulf carriers and Singapore, which are a category in itself, and I'll come back to it, why it's a unique environment, virtually everywhere else have been colossal failures. South African Airways, Alitalia, Thai Airways, Malaysian Airways, it goes on and on. All of the lost carriers of Central Europe, Czech Airlines, Malev in Hungary, Tarom in Romania. I can do around the Varig in Brazil. Around the mulberry bush. This is a colossal bad idea, as bad an idea as it could be. I single out as success stories the Gulf carriers and Singapore because they made the concerted decisions that they were small state, virtually city states for all practical purposes, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Singapore, and Doha, and they built their airlines as a pure element of economic development, and they really believed it. But everywhere else in the world, they just don't, that's not something that is believed. And so it's a really bad idea, and I would say would lead to all kinds of awkward environments. Well, will they own all airlines? You know, will they own part of us and part of WestJet and part of Porter? And how does that work exactly? And will they own, and in the US, will the US government own part of all of those airlines? It doesn't really work. And then what happens on competitiveness, and how do you actually, you know, build things? How do you make the difficult decisions that we made in the early stages of this pandemic with, you know, government policies that are public policies that are, you know, legitimate, and, you know, policies that may lead to, you know, global, you know, infrastructure or regional infrastructure, whatever it is. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that.
That seems clear. I want to ask you, you brought it up, but it gives us 10 minutes only, so you may be happy about that. To talk about your tenure, you did announce that you're retiring. You're not retiring yet, so I know you're still very much in charge there. But why now, Calin? You know, look, I'd say that it will have been almost 12 years by the time that I stepped down in February. It'll be almost 12 years from, you know, that April 1st, 2009 date that I came into the role. There is a time frame in large publicly traded companies for you know, the CEO to understand that it's time for him or her to move on after having done a bunch of things. So for me, we had always looked at 2020 as being the year. So we were planning. This was part of a succession that we planned for several years. I very much believe that the CEO, when we built something that involves culture change, as we've done here, that involves growth, I really wanted to participate in the selection of my successor, and which I did, and it's our CFO, Mike Russo, who's worked alongside me for the full 12 years, and it'll be a continuation of the culture. So I think that was an important ingredient, is that we had been planning this, and we had made him deputy CEO 2 years ago. And thirdly, I wanted to be there for the full heavy lifting that needed to be done to deal with this pandemic. And so we built something that we're calling a COVID mitigation and recovery plan. And so when I look at the various steps of the mitigation and recovery plan, you know, they are virtually all put in place. The remaining pieces are, you know, deals with government, frankly, but everything within our power. We've raised $6 billion. We've dealt with the workforce reductions, dealt with the fleet reductions. We dealt with the new fleet orders. We dealt with the biosafety initiatives and the testing initiatives. We've kind of put in place everything to get our cost structure down. We're taking out $3 billion of capital expenditures over the next 3 years. So that was the mitigation part. And on the recovery side, you know, we just launched our new Aeroplan program, which is going to be, you know, we said we're going to play offense as well. We can't only play defense in this environment. So we said we launched the Aeroplan program. We're expanding our cargo business. We expect that to be a key ingredient going forward for the next several years. You know, we've completed our passenger reservation system initiatives, and we've signed Transat. We signed the initial deal, then we renegotiated it in COVID, and expect that to close. We're working through the regulatory approval. So when we exit, and when I exit, Air Canada will be extremely well positioned to you know, to not only deal with COVID, but to thrive on the way out the other side. And so, you know, my definition of success is not only, you know, doing a good job while I'm there, but ensuring that when I leave, that the company is well positioned to succeed. You know, a long time ago, you alluded to this. Airlines, especially in the U.S., went through a revolving door of restructuring. Right? They went into bankruptcy. They came out of bankruptcy for a bunch of reasons, some of which are resolving. But an airline analyst once said, "There's a once-in-a-decade opportunity to invest in airlines," and it's right. You know, as they're going through that credit restructuring. you've gone through this with Air Canada. You've had 11 years, not 10 years before the pandemic, of a great run, as you said, in the stock. When you think of the company now and where it's positioned, is this a once in a decade opportunity to invest in this? Are you as you leave it here, not quite out of the woods yet? Is it safe flying ahead for Air Canada?
Look, yes, I think that the idea is yes. I think there are a lot of unpredictables that come out of government. The fact is that we built a company that is sustainable, with all of the tools that it has in an environment that it has some modicum of control over. In an environment where it's got zero control, you never know. That's why I think I would be ill-placed to give financial advice to the many people who are undoubtedly waiting at the bit to invest in our stock. We were the number one stock for the decade. I don't know if you saw that, Amanda. We were, December 31st, 2019, from January 1st, 2010, December 31st, 2019, the TSX had us as the top performing stock on the TSX, which was like unthinkable for airlines in an environment like that. And will we see that again? That I truly don't know. But I can say that what we've sought to do was not only to build great stock market performance, but to build a company that lasts and can thrive in good times and that can survive in bad times. And we were put to the test through this COVID environment with zero sector support from government. And thus far we've survived and we've raised liquidity and we're still there. So I wouldn't bet against Air Canada, let me put it to you this way, even after I'm gone.
And what are you most afraid of when you think about what lies ahead between here and safety? Between here and safety, between here and some return to normalcy, I would say, are the things that, the potential for curveballs in this industry and the lack of coordination of governments, I would say, is the biggest risk factor here. Because, this is by definition, aviation is an interconnected business. That is what we do. That is the core. That is our core business, is connecting people to places and cargo to places. And to the extent that, we're not able to get out of the starting blocks in Canada, that would be bad. But assuming you get out of the starting blocks, but then you have an impediment in India, a different impediment in China, a different impediment in the United States, a different impediment in Australia and New Zealand and so on, which is a little bit of what we've seen over the last 6 or 7 months, a bit of a confused environment where different policies are coming at you from all different angles. That is a risk factor, I would say. But I think that that's a risk factor that hopefully, as the vaccine is distributed adequately, that risk factor starts dissipating. But for sure, it's a risk factor. There is one issue, and it's probably where we're going to have to finish, but that you'll leave your successor with, and that is a global pivot to net zero, right? So we want net zero carbon emissions. Air Canada obviously had been already thinking about biofuels and improving. The pivot feels more serious than even some of those moves suggest. Calin, how big a deal will it be for global air travel that is where we're going in every way?
No, for sure. So you're quite right. We were already on that path, and ironically, COVID has accelerated that because we've taken out 79, aircraft that were consuming more fuel, that were less efficient from a carbon footprint perspective than the new aircraft that were purchased, materially so, like 30% in some cases, right? So, we are removing 79 aircraft in one fell swoop, which we would not have otherwise done. So that is a step towards our, carbon neutral direction. Then, of course, sustainable alternative fuels. We were already involved with that. But we had several projects where we were, intending to partner in a more meaningful way before COVID, and we will get back to all of those. We were participating in a sustainable fuel farm that was being built out of several locations, including in Los Angeles, and with our partnership with United, we're doing several things. So this is an area that you will see increasing focus on. I think the airline industry was one of the leaders, if not the only one, that set its own targets for carbon neutrality. And that also involved a delicate balance between mature carriers that, like Air Canada and like the US carriers that had been burning fossil fuels for a long period of time. And then the newer carrier says, well, I'm just starting, I'm going to grow. The next 20 years will be my years of growth. Why should I pay more when Air Canada and United and Delta and British Airways and Lufthansa, so the industry actually got a good balance. And this was what we call CORSIA, which is the industry standard. So, I'm very confident that Air Canada will be a leader in sustainable fuels, will be a leader in carbon footprint, and COVID, in an ironic sort of a fashion, has accelerated that.
All right, and I do have one last bonus question that I know you won't like, but you have competitors, but most notably WestJet, and you mentioned Porter. Did all three survive this? Do those two competitors survive this?
Well, look, we don't wish ill, seriously, and I really say this without a smile on my face. I really don't wish ill on any of our competitors, because I've said this to them privately, and I've said it publicly in past analyst calls. Strong competitors make us stronger. And the fact that we had strong competitors domestically in WestJet and Porter, and internationally in the Gulf carriers and the Asian carriers, the European carriers, the US carriers, all of having strong competitors make us stronger. So I certainly don't wish to see their demise. I think that with the government support, I think that they should survive. They should all survive, and I certainly hope that they do.
Calin, thank you very much for your time. It's great to talk to you. Appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, Amanda. Good to see you again, and I've really enjoyed this.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Anita. Anita?
Thanks, Amanda. Viewers, my name is Anita McCuitt, and I'm president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Calin, on behalf of the club, thank you so much for joining us and providing your comments today. There were so many people tuned in, so it's clear that Canadians are really interested to know how Air Canada has been faring through all this, but also when we might be able to start flying again on a regular basis, and when that 14-day quarantine can be safely eased. So I found it very interesting to hear about that study at McMaster. Amanda, as always, great to have you to moderate the discussion. Guests, we hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow, Thursday, November 19th, we'll be joined by a powerhouse panel of female politicians, including former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, Leader of the Green Party, Annamie Paul, and the Honourable Bardish Chagger, Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. You won't want to miss it. Thank you again to TD and PwC for sponsoring today's event. Our events would not be possible without the generosity of our sponsors, and we are a nonprofit. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Guests, thank you for joining us. Stay healthy and stay safe.